The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 4, Side 1. The most conspicuous side of this Byzantine Renaissance was its art. From 726 to 842, the iconoclastic movement prohibited the sculptural or, with less strictness, pictorial representation of sacred beings. But in compensation it freed the artist from a monotonous confinement within ecclesiastical themes and turned him to the observation, portrayal, and decoration of secular life. The gods were replaced as subjects by the imperial family, aristocratic patrons, historical events, the animals of the forest, the plants and fruits of the field, the fond trivia of domestic life. Basil I built in his palace the Nia, or New Church, all adorned, says a contemporary, with fine pearls, gold, shining silver, mosaics, silks, and marble in 1,000 varieties. Much of the decoration recently uncovered in St. Sophia was the work of the 9th century. The central dome was rebuilt in 975 after an earthquake and then received its great mosaic of Christ seated on a rainbow. Additional mosaics were set up in 1028. The massive cathedral, like a living organism, achieved continued life by the death and renewal of its parts. The bronze doors installed in 838 were so renowned for excellence that similar doors were ordered from Constantinople for the monastery of Monte Cassino, the Cathedral of Amalfi, and the Basilica of San Paolo outside the walls of Rome. The last pair, made in Constantinople in 1070, still survives as a testimony to Byzantine art. The royal or sacred palace, of which the Nia formed the chapel, was a growing congeries of chambers, reception halls, churches, baths, pavilions, gardens, peristyles, and courts. Almost every emperor added something to it. Theophilus gave the group a new oriental touch with a throne room known as triconchus, from the shell-like apses that formed 3 of its sides, a plan imported from Syria. North of this he built the Hall of the Pearl, south of it several heliaca, or sun-rooms, and the camelus, an apartment with roof of gold, columns of green marble, and an exceptionally fine mosaic representing on a gold ground men and women gathering fruit. Even this mosaic was surpassed in an adjoining structure, on whose walls green mosaic trees stood out against a golden mosaic sky, and by the floor of the Hall of Harmony, whose marble tesserae give the effect of a meadow in full flower. Theophilus carried his taste for bizarre splendor à outrance in his palace of Magnora. In its audience chamber, a golden plane tree overhung the throne. Golden birds sat on the branches and the throne. Golden griffins lay on either side of the royal seat, and golden lions at its foot. When a foreign ambassador was presented, the mechanical griffins rose, the mechanical lions stood up, swished their tails and roared, and the birds broke into mechanical song. All this was a frank copy of like absurdities in the palace of Harun al-Rashid at Baghdad. Constantinople was beautified with the taxes of commerce and the themes, but enough remained to add some lesser splendors to the provincial capitals. The monasteries, rich again, rose in stately mass. In the 10th century, the Lavra and Iveron at Athos; in the 11th, St. Luke's in Phocis; the Neomoni in Chios; the convent of Daphne near Eleusis, whose almost classic mosaics are the finest examples of the mid-Byzantine style. Georgia, Armenia, and Asia Minor shared in the movement and became outposts of Byzantine art. The public buildings of Antioch drew Moslem eulogies. In Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was rebuilt soon after Heraclius's victories. In Egypt, before and after the Arab conquest, the Coptic Christians raised domed churches, modest in size, but adorned with such artistry in metal, ivory, wood, and textiles, that all the skills of Pharaonic, Ptolemaic, Roman, Byzantine, and Mohammedan Egypt seem to have reached them as an unimpaired legacy. The iconoclastic persecutions drove thousands of monks from Syria, Asia Minor, and Constantinople to southern Italy, where they were protected by the popes. Through these refugees and through Oriental merchants, Byzantine styles of architecture and decoration flourished in Bari, Otranto, Benevento, Naples, even Rome. Ravenna continued to be Greek in art, and produced in the 7th century the magnificent mosaics of St. Apollinaris in Classe. Salonika remained Byzantine and adorned its own St. Sophia with somber mosaic apostles as gaunt as El Greco's saints. In all these lands and cities, as in the capital, the Byzantine Renaissance poured forth masterpieces of mosaic, miniature, pottery, enamel, glass, wood, ivory, bronze, iron, gems, and textiles, woven, dyed, and decorated with a skill that all the world honored. Byzantine artists made cups of blue glass decorated under the surface with golden foliage, birds, and human figures, glass vessels with the necking of enameled arabesques and flowers, and other forms of glass so exquisite that they were the favorite gifts of Byzantine emperors to foreign potentates. Even more valued as presents were the costly robes, shawls, copes, and dalmatics that displayed Byzantine textile art. Such were Charlemagne's cloak in the Cathedral of Metz, and the delicate silks found at Aachen in the coffin of that king. Half the majesty that hedged in the Greek emperor, much of the awe that exalted the patriarch, some of the splendor that clothed the Redeemer, the Virgin, and the martyrs in the ritual of the Church, came from gorgeous vestments that embodied the lives of a dozen artisans, the technique of centuries, and the richest dyes of land and sea. The Byzantine goldsmiths and gem cutters were at the top of their line until the 13th century. The treasury of St. Mark's at Venice is rich with the spoils of their craft. To this age belong the astonishingly realistic mosaic of St. Luke, now in the Collège des Hautes Études at Paris, the glowing head of Christ in the Desis mosaic in St. Sophia's, and the immense mosaic covering 40 square yards unearthed in Istanbul in 1935 from the ruins of the palace of the Macedonian emperors. When iconoclasm subsided, or where it did not reach, the churches fed piety with icons painted in tempera upon wood, and sometimes cased in enameled or jeweled frames. No miniatures in all the history of illumination surpassed the vision of Ezekiel in the 9th century volume of Gregory Nazianzen's sermons in the Bibliothèque Nationale at Paris, or the 400 illustrations of the Menologus manuscript in the Vatican, circa 1000, or the pictures of David in the Paris Psalter, circa 900. We shall find in them no perspective, no modeling of forms through light and shade, but as ample recompense, a rich and sensuous coloring, a lively play of imagination, a new knowledge of human and animal anatomy, a happy riot of beasts and birds, of plants and flowers, among saints and deities, fountains, arcades, and porticos, birds pecking at fruit, bears dancing, stags and bulls locking their horns in battle, and a leopard lifting an impious leg to make a flowing initial for a pious phrase. Byzantine potters had long known the art of enameling, that is, applying to a terracotta or metal base a metallic oxide which, when fired, fused with the base and gave it both protection and brilliance. The art had come from the Orient to ancient Greece, had disappeared in the 3rd century B.C., and had reappeared in the 3rd century A.D. This mid-Byzantine period was rich in enamels, portrait medallions, icons, crosses, reliquaries, cups, chalices, book covers, and ornaments for harness and other equipage. As early as the 6th century, Byzantium received from Sasanian Persia the art of cloisonné enamel. The colored paste was poured onto surface areas confined by thin wires or metal strips. These cloisons, soldered to a metal base, constituted the decorative design. A famous example of Byzantine cloisonné is a reliquary made circa 948 for Constantine Porphyrogenitus, and now in Limburg. It is characteristically Byzantine in its minute and conscientious execution, its ornate and luxurious ornament. No other art has been so overwhelmingly religious as the Byzantine. A church council of 787 laid down the law. It is for painters to execute. It is for clergy to ordain the subjects and govern the procedure. Hence the somber seriousness of this art, its narrow scope of theme, its monotony of method and style, the rarity of its ventures into realism, humor, and common life. Ornate and brilliant beyond rival, it never reached the lusty variety and scandalous secularity of mature Gothic art. So much the more must we marvel at its victories and influence. All Christendom from Kiev to Cadiz acknowledged its leadership and flattered it with imitation. Even China bowed to it now and then. In its Syrian forms, it shared with Persia in molding the architecture, mosaics, and decorative motives of Islamic art. Venice modeled itself on Constantinople, and St. Mark's on the Church of the Apostles there. Byzantine architecture appeared in France, and mounted as far north as Aachen. Illuminated manuscripts everywhere in the West confessed Byzantine influence. The Bulgars took over Byzantine faith and ornament, and the conversion of Vladimir to Greek Christianity opened a dozen avenues by which Byzantine art entered into Russian life. From the 5th to the 12th century, Byzantine civilization led Christian Europe in administration, diplomacy, revenue, manners, culture, and art. Probably never before had there been a society so splendidly adorned, or a religion so sensuously colorful. Like every other civilization, it rested on the backs of serfs or slaves, and the gold and marble of its shrines and palaces were the transmuted sweat of workers toiling on or in the earth. Like every other culture of its time, it was cruel. The same man who knelt before the image of the Virgin could slaughter the children of Maurice before their father's eyes. There was something shallow about it, a veneer of aristocratic refinement covering a mass of popular superstition, fanaticism, and literate ignorance. And half the culture was devoted to perpetuating that ignorance. No science, no philosophy was allowed to develop in conflict with that ignorance, and for 1,000 years no addition was made by a Greek civilization to man's knowledge of the world. No work of Byzantine literature has caught the imagination of mankind, or won the suffrages of time. Oppressed by the fullness of its heritage, imprisoned in the theological labyrinths in which dying Greece had lost the Christianity of Christ, the medieval Greek mind could not rise to a mature and realistic view of man and the world. It broke Christianity in half over a vowel, and again over a word, and shattered the Eastern Roman Empire by seeing treason in every heresy. The marvel remains that this civilization lasted so long. What hidden resources or inner vitality enabled it to survive the victories of Persia in Syria, the loss of Syria, Egypt, Sicily, and Spain to the Moslems? Perhaps the same religious faith that weakened defense by relying upon relics and miracles gave some order and discipline to a people perennially patient, however periodically turbulent, and surrounded emperor and state with an aura of sanctity that frightened change. The bureaucracy, collectively immortal, gave continuity and stability through all wars and revolutions, kept internal peace, regulated the economy, and gathered in the taxes that permitted the empire to expand again almost to its Justinian amplitude. Though the possessions of the caliphs were vaster than the Byzantine, their revenues were probably less, and the looseness of Moslem government, the inadequacy of its communications and its administrative machinery, allowed the Abbasid dominion to disintegrate in 3 centuries, while the Byzantine Empire endured through a millennium. Byzantine civilization performed 3 vital functions. For 1,000 years it stood as a bulwark of Europe against Persia and Eastern Islam. It faithfully cherished and fully transmitted, until plundered by the Crusaders in 1204, the recopied texts that handed down the literature, science, and philosophy of ancient Greece. Monks fleeing iconoclast emperors brought Greek manuscripts to South Italy and restored there a knowledge of Greek letters. Greek professors, shunning Moslem and Crusader alike, left Constantinople, sometimes settled in Italy, and served as carriers of the classic germ. So year by year Italy rediscovered Greece, until men drank themselves drunk at the fountain of intellectual freedom. And finally it was Byzantium that won Bulgars and Slavs from barbarism to Christianity, and brought the immeasurable force of the Slavic body and soul into the life and destiny of Europe. 6. The Balkans, 558 to 1057. For only a few hundred miles north of Constantinople were troubled oceans of men disdainful of letters and half in love with war. The Hun tide had hardly ebbed when a new people of kindred blood, the Avars, moved from Turkestan through southern Russia in 558, enslaved masses of Slavs, raided Germany to the Elbe in 562, drove the Lombards into Italy in 568, and so ravaged the Balkans that the Latin-speaking population there was almost wiped out. For a time the power of the Avars reached from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In 626 they besieged and almost captured Constantinople. Their failure began their decline. In 805 they were conquered by Charlemagne, and gradually they were absorbed by the Bulgars and the Slavs. The Bulgars, originally a mixture of Hun, Ugrian, and Turkish blood, had formed a part of the Hun Empire in Russia. After Attila's death, one branch established a kingdom, Old Bulgaria, along the Volga around the modern Kazan. Their capital, Bulgar, was enriched by the river trade and prospered till it was destroyed by the Tatars in the 13th century. In the 5th century, another branch migrated southwest to the valley of the Don. One tribe of these, the Utigurs, crossed the Danube in 679, founded a second Bulgarian kingdom in the ancient Mysia, enslaved the Slavs there, adopted their language and institutions, and were ultimately absorbed into the Slavic stock. The new state reached its zenith under the Khan, or chief, Krum, in 802, a man of barbarian courage and civilized cunning. He invaded Macedonia, a province of the Eastern Empire, captured 1,100 pounds of gold, and burned down the town of Sardica, now, as Sofia, Bulgaria's capital. The Emperor Nicephorus bettered the instruction by burning Pliska, Krum's capital, in 811. But Krum trapped and destroyed the Greek army in a mountain pass, slew Nicephorus, and made the imperial skull his drinking cup. In 813 he besieged Constantinople, fired its suburbs, and devastated Thrace, rehearsing the events of 1913. He was preparing another attack when he burst a blood vessel and died. His son Omertag made peace with the Greeks, who yielded to him half of Thrace. Under Khan Boris, from 852 to 888, Bulgaria adopted Christianity. Boris himself, after a long reign, entered a monastery, emerged 4 years later to depose his elder son Vladimir and enthrone his younger son Simeon, lived till 907, and was canonized as the first of Bulgaria's national saints. Simeon, from 893 to 927, became one of the great kings of his time. He extended his rule to Serbia and the Adriatic, called himself emperor and autocrat of all the Bulgars and Greeks, and repeatedly made war against Byzantium. But he tried to civilize his people with translated Greek literature and to beautify his Danubian capital with Greek art. A contemporary describes Preslav as a marvel to behold, full of high palaces and churches, richly adorned. In the 13th century it was the largest city in the Balkans. Some scanty ruins remain. After Simeon's death, Bulgaria was weakened with civil strife. Bogomil heretics converted half the peasantry to pacifism and communism. Serbia recovered its independence in 931. The Emperor John Tzimices reconquered eastern Bulgaria for the Greek Empire in 972. Basil II conquered western Bulgaria in 1014, and Bulgaria became again, from 1018 to 1186, a province of Byzantium. Meanwhile, that harassed empire had received a visit in 942 from a new barbarian horde. The Magyars, like the Bulgars, were probably derived from those tribes, loosely named Ugri or Igurs, whence ogre, who wandered on the western confines of China. They too had, through long association, a strong infusion of Hun and Turkish blood. They spoke a tongue closely related to those of the Finns and the Samoyeds. In the 9th century they migrated from the Ural-Caspian steppes to the lands adjoining the Don, the Dnieper, and the Black Sea. There they lived by tilling the soil in summer, fishing in winter, and at all seasons capturing and selling Slavs as slaves to the Greeks. After some 60 years in the Ukraine, they again moved westward. Europe was then at nadir. No strong government existed west of Constantinople. No united army stood in the way. In 889, the Magyars overran Bessarabia and Moldavia. In 895, under their chieftain Arpad, they began their permanent conquest of Hungary. In 899, they poured over the Alps into Italy, burned Pavia and all its 43 churches, massacred the inhabitants, and for an entire year ravaged the peninsula. They conquered Pannonia, raided Bavaria from 900 to 907, devastated Carinthia in 901, took Moravia in 906, plundered Saxony, Thuringia, Swabia in 913, southern Germany and Alsace in 917, and overwhelmed the Germans on the Lech, a tributary of the Danube, in 924. All Europe trembled and prayed, for these invaders were still pagan, and all Christendom seemed doomed. But in 933 the Magyars were defeated at Gotha, and their advance was stayed. In 943 they again invaded Italy. In 955 they pillaged Burgundy. At last in that year the united armies of Germany, under Otto I, won a decisive victory on the Lechfeld, or valley of the Lech, near Augsburg. And Europe, having in one terrible century, from 841 to 955, fought the Normans in the north, the Moslems in the south, and the Magyars in the east, could breathe among its ruins. The Magyars, subdued, made Europe more secure by accepting Christianity in 975. Prince Giza feared the absorption of Hungary into the expanding Byzantine Empire. He chose Latin Christianity to win peace in the west, and married his son Stephen to Gisela, daughter of Henry II, Duke of Bavaria. Stephen I, from 997 to 1038, became Hungary's patron saint and greatest king. He organized the Magyars on the lines of German feudalism and accentuated the religious basis of the new society by accepting kingdom and crown of Hungary from Pope Sylvester II in 1000. Benedictine monks flocked in, built monasteries and villages, and introduced Western techniques of agriculture and industry. So, after a century of war, Hungary passed from barbarism to civilization, and when Queen Gisela presented a cross to a German friend, it was already a masterpiece of the goldsmith's art. The earliest known home of the Slavs was a marshy region of Russia enclosed by Kiev, Moilev, and Brest-Litovsk. They were of Indo-European stock and spoke languages related to German and Persian. Periodically overrun by nomad hordes, often enslaved, always oppressed and poor, they grew patient and strong through endless hardships, and the fertility of their women overcame the high mortality born of famine, disease, and chronic war. They lived in caves or mud huts, hunted, herded, fished, and tended bees, sold honey, wax, and skins, and slowly resigned themselves to settled tillage. Themselves hunted even into hardly accessible marshes and forests, brutally captured and callously sold, they adopted the morals of their time and bartered men for goods. Inhabiting a cold and damp terrain, they warmed themselves with strong liquor. They found Christianity preferable to Mohammedanism, which forbade alcoholic drinks. Drunkenness, uncleanliness, cruelty, and a passion for pillage were their outstanding faults. Thrift, caution, and imagination hovered in them between virtue and vice. But also they were good-natured, hospitable, sociable, and loved games, dances, music, and song. The chieftains were polygamous, the poor monogamous, the women, bought or captured for marriage, were anomalously faithful and obedient. The patriarchal families were loosely organized in clans, and these in tribes. The clans may have owned property in common in their early pastoral stage, but the growth of agriculture, in which different degrees of energy and ability on diverse soils produced unequal results, generated private or family property. Frequently divided by migration and fraternal war, the Slavs developed a variety of Slavonic languages: Polish, Wendish, Czech and Slovak in the west, Slovene, Serbo-Croat, and Bulgarian in the south, Great Russian, White Russian, and Little Russian, Ruthenian, and Ukrainian in the east. Nearly all of these, however, have remained intelligible to the speakers of any one of them. Pan-Slavism of speech and customs, along with space, resources, and a vitality born of hard conditions, rigorous selection, and simple food, made the spreading power of the Slavs. As the German tribes moved south and west in their migrations into Italy and Gaul, an area of low population pressure was left behind them in north and central Germany. Drawn into this vacuum and prodded by the invading Huns, the Slavs expanded westward across the Vistula even to the Elbe. In these lands they became the Wends, Poles, Czechs, Vlachs, and Slovaks of later history. Towards the end of the 6th century, a torrent of Slav immigration flooded rural Greece. The cities closed their gates against it, but a strong Slavonic infusion entered the Hellenic blood. About 640, two kindred Slav tribes, the Serbi and the Crobatai, repeopled Pannonia and Illyricum. The Serbs accepted Greek, the Croats Roman Christianity. This religious division, crossing ethnic and linguistic unity, weakened the nation against its neighbors, and Serbia fluctuated between independence and subjection to Byzantium or Bulgaria. In 989, the Bulgarian Tsar Samuel, having defeated and captured the Serbian John Vladimir, gave him his daughter Kosara in marriage, and allowed him to return to Zeta, his capital, as a vassal prince. This is the theme of the oldest Serb novel, Vladimir and Kosara, written in the 13th century. The coastal cities of the ancient Dalmatia, Zara, Spalato, Ragusa, retained their Latin language and culture. The remainder of Serbia became Slav. Prince Voislav freed Serbia in 1042, but in the 12th century it again acknowledged the suzerainty of Byzantium. When at the end of the 8th century this amazing migration of the Slavs was complete, all Central Europe, the Balkans, and Russia were a Slavic sea beating upon the borders of Constantinople, Greece, and Germany. 7. The birth of Russia, 509 to 1054. The Slavs were but the latest of many peoples who rejoiced in the rich soil, spacious steppes, and many navigable rivers of Russia, and mourned the miasmic marshes and forbidding forests, and the absence of natural barriers to hostile invasion, summer's heat or winter's cold. On its least inhospitable coasts, the western and northern fringes of the Black Sea, the Greeks had founded a score of towns: Olbia, Tannius, Theodosia, Panticapaeum, now Kerch, as early as the 7th century B.C., and had engaged in trade and war with the Scythians of the hinterland. These natives, probably of Iranian origin, imbibed some civilization from the Persians and the Greeks, and even produced a philosopher, Anacharsis, around 600 B.C., who came to Athens and argued with Solon. During the 2nd century B.C., another Iranian tribe, the Sarmatians, conquered and displaced the Scythians, and amid this turmoil the Greek colonies decayed. In the 2nd century A.D., the Goths entered from the west and established the Ostrogothic kingdom. About 375, this was overthrown by the Huns, and thereafter for centuries the southern plains of Russia saw hardly any civilization, but rather a succession of nomad hordes: Bulgars, Avars, slaves, Khazars, Magyars, Patsanaks, Cumans, and Mongols. The Khazars were of Turkish origin. In the 7th century they expanded through the Caucasus into South Russia, established an orderly dominion from the Dnieper to the Caspian Sea, and built a capital, Ital, at a mouth of the Volga near the present Astrakhan. Their kings and upper classes accepted the Jewish religion. Hemmed in between a Moslem and a Christian empire, they probably preferred to displease both equally rather than one dangerously. At the same time, they gave full freedom to the varied creeds of the people. 7 courts administered justice, 2 for Muslims, 2 for Christians, 2 for Jews, 1 for heathens. An appeal was allowed from the last 5 to the Moslem courts, whose administration of justice was at that time considered best. Encouraged by this enlightened policy, merchants of various faiths gathered in the Khazar towns. A lively trade developed there between the Baltic and the Caspian seas, and Ital in the 8th century was one of the great commercial cities of the world. In the 9th century, Khazaria was overrun by Turkish nomads. The government could no longer protect its trade channels from brigandage and piracy, and in the 10th century the Khazar kingdom melted away into the ethnic chaos from which it had taken form. Into that motley multitude of south and central Russia in the 6th century came a migration of Slavic tribes from the Carpathian Mountains. They settled the valleys of the Dnieper and the Don and reached out more thinly to Lake Ilmen in the north. For centuries they multiplied, year by year clearing the forests, draining the swamps, eliminating wild beasts, creating the Ukraine. They spread over the plains in a movement of human fertility rivaled only by the Hindus and the Chinese. All through known history they have been on the march, into the Caucasus and Turkestan, into the Urals and Siberia. This process of colonization goes on today, and the Slav Ocean every year enters new ethnic bays. Early in the 9th century, an apparently negligible attack came upon Slavdom from the northwest. The Scandinavian Vikings could spare men and energy from their assaults upon Scotland, Iceland, Ireland, England, Germany, France, and Spain to send into northern Russia bands of 100 or 200 men to prey upon the communities of Balts, Finns, and Slavs, and then return with their booty. To protect their robberies with law and order, these Varangians, or Varangians, followers of a chieftain, established fortified posts on their routes, and gradually they settled down as a ruling Scandinavian minority of armed merchants among a subject peasantry. Some towns hired them as guardians of social order and security. Apparently the guardians converted their wages into tribute and became the masters of their employers. By the middle of the 9th century they governed Novgorod, or New Fort, and had extended their rule as far south as Kiev. The routes and settlements they controlled were loosely bound into a commercial and political empire called Rus, or Rus, a term of much disputed derivation. The great rivers that traversed the land connected, through canals and short overland hauls, the Baltic and Black Seas, and invited a southward expansion of Varangian trade and power. Soon these fearless merchant warriors were selling their goods or services in Constantinople itself. Conversely, as commerce grew more regular on the Dnieper, the Volkhov, and the western Dvina, Moslem merchants came up from Baghdad and Byzantium and traded spices, wines, silks, and gems for furs, amber, honey, wax, and slaves. Hence the great number of Islamic and Byzantine coins found along these rivers, and even in Scandinavia. As Moslem control of the eastern Mediterranean blocked the flow of European products through French and Italian outlets to Levantine ports, Marseille, Genoa, and Pisa declined in the 9th and 10th centuries, while in Russia towns like Novgorod, Smolensk, Chernigov, Kiev, and Rostov flourished through Scandinavian, Slavic, Moslem, and Byzantine trade. The ancient chronicle of Russia, 12th century, gave personality to this Scandinavian infiltration by its tale of 3 princes. The Finnish and Slavic population of Novgorod and its vicinity, having driven out their Varangian overlords, fell to so much quarreling among themselves that they invited the Varangians to send them a ruler or general, this in 862. 3 brothers came, says the story, Rurik, Cineas, and Truber, and established the Russian state. The story may be true, despite latter-day skepticism, or it may be a patriotic gloss on a Scandinavian conquest of Novgorod. The chronicle further relates that Rurik sent 2 of his aides, Askold and Dir, to take Constantinople, that these Vikings stopped en route to capture Kiev and then declared themselves independent of both Rurik and the Khazars. In 860, Kiev was strong enough to send a fleet of 200 vessels to attack Constantinople. The expedition failed, but Kiev remained the commercial and political focus of Russia. It gathered under its power an extensive hinterland, and its earliest rulers, Askold, Oleg, and Igor, rather than Rurik at Novgorod, might justly be called the founders of the Russian state. Oleg, Igor, and the able Princess Olga, Igor's widow, and her warrior son Sviatoslav, 962 to 972, widened the Kievan realm until it embraced nearly all the eastern Slavonic tribes and the towns of Polotsk, Smolensk, Chernigov, and Rostov. Between 860 and 1043, the young principality made 6 attempts to take Constantinople. So old is the Russian drive to the Bosporus, the Russian hunger for secure access to the Mediterranean. With Vladimir, 972 to 1015, 5th Grand Duke of Kiev, Rus, as the new principality called itself, became Christian, this in 989. Vladimir married the sister of the Emperor Basil II, and thereafter, till 1917, Russia, in religion, alphabet, coinage, and art, was a daughter of Byzantium. Greek priests explained to Vladimir the divine origin and right of kings, and the usefulness of this doctrine in promoting social order and monarchical stability. Under Vladimir's son Yaroslav, from 1036 to 1054, the Kievan state reached its zenith. Its authority was loosely acknowledged, and taxes were received by it from Lake Ladoga and the Baltic to the Caspian, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea. The Scandinavian invaders were absorbed, and Slav blood and speech prevailed. Social organization was frankly aristocratic. The prince entrusted administration and defense to a higher nobility of boyars, and a lesser nobility of dietski or otroki, pages or retainers. Below these came the merchants, the townspeople, the semi-servile peasantry, and the slaves. A code of laws, Ruskaya Pravda, or Russian right, sanctioned private revenge, the judicial duel, and the compurgative oath, but established trial by a jury of 12 citizens. Vladimir founded a school for boys at Kiev, Yaroslav another at Novgorod. Kiev, the meeting point of boats from the Volkhov, the Dvina, and the lower Dnieper, took toll of all passing merchandise. Soon it was rich enough to build 400 churches and a great cathedral, another St. Sophia, in the Byzantine style. Greek artists were imported to decorate these buildings with mosaics, frescoes, and other Byzantine ornament, and Greek music entered to prepare for the triumphs of Russian choral song. Slowly, Russia lifted itself out of its dirt and dust, built palaces for its princes, raised cupolas above huts of mud, and out of the patient strength of its people reared little isles of civilization in a still barbarous sea. Chapter 19. The Decline of the West, 566 to 1066. While Islam was on the march and Byzantium was recovering from seemingly fatal blows, Europe fought its way up through the Dark Ages. This is a loose term which any man may define to his prejudice. We shall arbitrarily confine it to non-Byzantine Europe between the death of Boethius in 524 and the birth of Abelard in 1079. Byzantine civilization continued to flourish during this period, despite severe losses of territory and prestige. But Western Europe in the 6th century was a chaos of conquest, disintegration, and rebarbarization. Much of the classic culture survived, for the most part silent and hidden in a few monasteries and families. But the physical and psychological foundations of social order had been so disturbed that centuries would be needed to restore them. Love of letters, devotion to art, the unity and continuity of culture, the cross-fertilization of communicating minds, fell before the convulsions of war, the perils of transport, the economies of poverty, the rise of vernaculars, the disappearance of Latin from the East and of Greek from the West. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Moslem control of the Mediterranean, the raiding of European coasts and towns by Normans, Magyars, and Saracens, accelerated this localism of life and defense, this primitivism of thought and speech. Germany and Eastern Europe were a maelstrom of migrations, Scandinavia was a pirate's lair, Britain was overrun by Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Danes, Gaul by Franks, Normans, Burgundians, and Goths, Spain was torn between Visigoths and Moors, Italy had been shattered by the long war between the Goths and Byzantium, and the land that had given order to half the world suffered for 5 centuries a disintegration of morals, economy, and government. And yet, during that long darkness, Charlemagne, Alfred, and Otto I gave intervals of order and stimulus to France, England, and Germany. Erigena resurrected philosophy, Alcuin and others restored education, Gerbert imported Moslem science into Christendom, Leo IX and Gregory VII reformed and strengthened the Church, architecture developed the Romanesque style, and Europe began in the 11th century its slow ascent to the 12th and 13th, the greatest of medieval centuries. 1. Italy, 566 to 1095. 1. The Lombards, 568 to 774. 3 years after the death of Justinian, Byzantine rule was extinguished in northern Italy by the Lombard invasion. Paul the Deacon, who was one of them, thought that the Lombards, or Longobardi, owed their name to their long beards. They themselves believed that their original home had been Scandinavia, and so Dante, their descendant, apostrophized them. We find them on the lower Elbe in the 1st century, on the Danube in the 6th, used by Narses in his Italian campaign of 552, sent back to Pannonia after his victory, but never forgetting the fruitful loveliness of northern Italy. In 568, pressed on north and east by Avars, 130,000 Lombards, men, women, children, and baggage, moved laboriously across the Alps into Lombardy, the lush plains of the Po. Narses, who might have stopped them, had been deposed and disgraced a year before. Byzantium was busy with Avars and Persians. Italy itself, exhausted by the Gothic War, had no stomach for fighting and no money to pay for vicarious heroism. By 573 the Lombards held Verona, Milan, Florence, and Pavia, which became their capital. In 601 they captured Padua, in 603 Cremona and Mantua, in 640 Genoa. Their mightiest king, Liutprand, from 712 to 744, took Ravenna in eastern Italy, Spoleto in the center, Benevento in the south, and aspired to unite all Italy under his rule. Pope Gregory III could not allow the papacy to become a Lombard bishopric. He called in the unsubdued Venetians, who retook Ravenna for Byzantium. Liutprand had to content himself with giving northern and central Italy the best government they had had since Theodoric the Goth. Like Theodoric, he could not read. The Lombards developed a progressive civilization. The king was elected and advised by a council of notables, and usually submitted his legislation to a popular assembly of all free males of military age. King Rothari, in 643, published a code of laws at once primitive and advanced. It allowed money compensation for murder, proposed to protect the poor against the rich, ridiculed the belief in witchcraft, and gave freedom of worship to Catholic, Arian, and pagan alike. Intermarriage absorbed the Germanic invaders into the Italian blood and won them to the Latin tongue. The Lombards left their signature here and there in blue eyes, blonde hair, and a few Teutonic words in Italian speech. As the conquest subsided into law, the commerce natural to the valley of the Po was resumed. By the end of the Lombard period, the cities of northern Italy were rich and strong, ready for the arts and wars of their medieval peak. Literature faltered. From this age and realm, time has preserved only one book of significance, Paul the Deacon's History of the Lombards, circa 748. It is dull, poorly arranged, and without a grain of philosophic salt. But Lombardy left its name on architecture and finance. The building trades had retained some of their old Roman organization and skill. One group, the Magistri Comacini, or Masters of Como, took the lead in compounding a Lombard style of architecture that would later ripen into Romanesque. Within a generation after Liutprand, the Lombard kingdom broke against the rock of the papacy. King Aistulf seized Ravenna in 751 and ended the Byzantine exarchate. As the Ducatus Romanus, or Duchy of Rome, had been legally under the exarch, Aistulf claimed Rome as part of his widened realm. Pope Stephen II called upon Constantine Copronymus for aid. The Greek emperor sent a harmless note to Aistulf. Stephen, in a move of endless results, appealed to Pepin the Short, king of the Franks. Scenting empire, Pepin crossed the Alps, overwhelmed Aistulf, made Lombardy a Frank fief, and gave all central Italy to the papacy. The popes continued to acknowledge the formal suzerainty of the eastern emperors, but Byzantine authority was now ended in northern Italy. The Lombard vassal King Desiderius tried to restore the independence and conquests of Lombardy. Pope Hadrian I summoned a new Frank. Charlemagne swept down upon Pavia, consigned Desiderius to a monastery, ended the Lombard kingdom and made it a province of the Franks in 774. 2. The Normans in Italy, 1036 to 1085. Italy was now abandoned to 1,000 years of divided and alien rule, whose details we shall not chronicle. In 1036 the Normans began the conquest of southern Italy from the Byzantine power. The lords of Normandy were wont to transmit land to all sons equally, as in modern France, but whereas in France the law resulted in small families, in medieval Normandy it resulted in small holdings. With no taste for peaceful poverty, and with a zest for adventure and rapine still warm in their Viking memories, some lusty Normans hired themselves out to the rival dukes of southern Italy, fought valiantly for and against Benevento, Salerno, Naples, and Capua, and were given the town of Aversa as their reward. Other Norman young bloods, hearing of lands to be won for a blow or two, left Normandy for Italy. Soon the Normans there numbered enough to fight for themselves, and by 1053 the boldest of them, Robert Guiscard, that is, the wise or wily, had carved out a Norman kingdom in southern Italy. He was such stuff as myths are made of, taller than any of his soldiers, strong of arm and will, fair of features, blond of hair and beard, splendid in dress, greedy and liberal of gold, occasionally cruel, always brave. Recognizing no law but force and guile, Robert overran Calabria, took Benevento almost over the dead body of Pope Leo IX in 1054, struck alliance with Nicholas II, pledged him tribute and vassalage, and received from him title to Calabria, Apulia, and Sicily in 1059. Leaving his younger brother Roger to conquer Sicily, he himself captured Bari in 1071 and drove the Byzantines from Apulia. Fretting at the Adriatic barrier, he dreamed of crossing it, taking Constantinople, and making himself the mightiest monarch in Europe. He improvised a fleet and defeated the Byzantine navy off Durazzo in 1081. Byzantium appealed to Venice. Venice responded, for she could not be less than queen of the Adriatic, and in 1082 her skillful galleys routed Guiscard's ships not far from the site of his recent victory. But in the following year Robert, with Caesarian energy, transported his army to Durazzo, defeated there the forces of Alexius I, the Greek emperor, and marched across Epirus and Thessaly almost to Salonika. Then, on the verge of realizing his dream, he received a desperate appeal from Pope Gregory VII to come and save him from the Emperor Henry IV. Leaving his army in Thessaly, Robert hurried back to Italy, raised a new force of Normans, Italians, and Saracens, rescued the Pope, captured Rome from the Germans, suppressed an uprising of the people against his army, and allowed his angry soldiers to burn and sack the city so thoroughly that not even the Vandals of 451 could equal this destructiveness. This in 1084. Meanwhile, his son Bohemond returned to confess that his army in Greece had been destroyed by Alexius. The old buccaneer built a third fleet, defeated the Venetian navy off Corfu in 1084, took the Ionian isle of Cephalonia, and died there of infection or poison at the age of 70 in 1085. He was the first and greatest of the condottieri, the robber captains of Italy. 3. Venice, 451 to 1095. Meanwhile, at the northern end of the peninsula, a new state had been born, destined to grow in power and splendor while most of Italy withered in anarchy. In the barbarian invasions of the 5th and 6th centuries, above all during the Lombard invasion of 568, the populations of Aquileia, Padua, Belluno, Feltre, and other towns fled for safety to join the fisher folk who dwelt in the little islands formed by the Piave and Adige rivers at the head of the Adriatic Sea. Some refugees remained after the crises passed and founded the communities of Heraclea, Melamocco, Grado, Lido, and Rivo Alto, or Deep River, which as Rialto became the seat of their united government in 811. A tribe of Veneti had occupied northeastern Italy long before Caesar. In the 13th century, the name Venetia was applied to the unique city that had grown from the refugee settlements. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.